Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. Joining us today for a special live recording of AJC's podcast, People of the Pod, is Jewish Insider's national politics reporter, Jacob Kornbluh. Jacob, a Brooklyn resident who was attacked on October 7th while reporting on anti-lockdown protests in his own neighborhood, joined Seffi Kogen for a discussion on why the Ultra-Orthodox community has been so hard hit by the pandemic, what is fueling the recent protests, and where the community should go from here. After we hear from Seffi and Jacob, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. And if you like Advocacy Anywhere, be sure to subscribe to AJC's podcast, People of the Pod. Head to ajc.org/podcast or your favorite podcast app, or text AJC podcast to 52886 to subscribe today. And Seffi, with that, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jillian. As Jillian mentioned, 2 weeks ago on October 7th, while reporting on protests in the Ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community in Brooklyn, Jacob, you were attacked by a mob of Haredi Jews who spat at you, kicked you, called you a number of names, including perhaps worst of all, Nazi, such that you had to be evacuated by police and seek safety at a police station, all because you have publicly called for the community to follow the coronavirus restrictions put in place by the city and state of New York. So let me start off now, before going into any questions, let me start off by repeating what we said at the time on behalf of all of us here at AJC, Jacob. We are glad that you're okay. This guy, Heshi Tischler, who incited the mob against you, says that the Haredi community is, quote, at war against Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio. He has what he calls an army who appear to be mostly teenage Haredi boys. For our listeners who aren't familiar with this character, can you tell us, who is this guy, Heshi Tischler?
He's a longtime resident of the Borough Park community. Obviously, he's been, he's an expediter. He's helped on a communal level. But in recent years, he is seeking public office. He tried his luck in 2017. He came in third place with 500 votes. In recent months, obviously, he has tapped into that anger and frustration at how government is approaching this pandemic, primarily the slow, gradual reopening process, where members of the community felt that the mayor and the governor have applied a one standard for all when it comes to restrictions and to reopening. And therefore, while we are a more insular community, but a large community, very dense, members of the community felt that opening houses of worship, resuming businesses, and opening playgrounds and schools were not done fast enough. In the summer, the positivity rate was very low. And so while people were lax, because of, they were just, watching reports, accepting reality, but also not seeing the numbers that we saw in mid-March, when the outbreak began. They returned to normal. It wasn't that the government had advised them, you can resume services, you can resume weddings and gatherings. It was just there was basically no enforcement, but also no guidance, no reaching out to the community, no education about how severe this virus is. It was only in early September, when there was already a few weeks of an uptick in positive cases within the community, that the mayor and the governor stepped in and said, hey, this is alarming. So this individual, who has been in recent months already, gaining a following just because he defied government, he called for non-compliance. He actually broke into some playgrounds and alerted the media about it. He actually stood with lawmakers representing this community just because they felt that if they would not stand with him, they would lose support within the community. And so, emboldened by that following, he appointed himself as spokesperson for the community in creating this bad image that portrayed the Orthodox Jewish Hasidic community as a people who are spreading the virus, who are disobeying the law. That wasn't the case. It was just one leader leading a very fringe and loud group that made it to the headlines.
Well, so let me ask you about that, because you and I certainly know that the Orthodox community is not a monolith, and even within the Orthodox community, the Haredi community is not a monolith. It sounded like you were just saying that this kind of anti-lockdown movement within the Haredi community doesn't really exist at all, that it's just a few loudmouths. Is that true? I mean, are there significant differences within parts of the community about people who are in favor of masking, in favor of lockdown? Are there some places or some Hasidic sects where the restrictions are more or less controversial?
I would separate it into three groups. You have one group mostly within the Orthodox community, but also spreading within the Hasidic community, that comply with all the government regulations, law-abiding citizens who understand how severe this is. Just because we were hard hit and because we lost so many relatives and friends, that they understand that they need to get along, come along, collective responsibility to actually face this heads on. There's the second group, which is more within the Hasidic community, who don't trust government, distrust secular authorities, but with the right guidance, with the right approach, would not go against, would not be anti-lockdown, would not engage in violent protests or even speak out against compliance. That is the majority that government failed to actually reach out to and to make sure that the right approach is taken in order to bring down this infection rate, in order to fight this virus. The third group is that group that you described, the anti-lockdown movement, who are basically people who are either angry, frustrated at what government represents, but also follow the guidance of the guy who was elected 4 years ago, who said in the beginning, this is a democratic hoax, that you can contract the virus because you will receive the treatment and get out of this, beat it within 2 days. So what? People are getting sick. It's fine. Number one, we can get to herd immunity. And number two, these are a bunch of Democrats who are trying to impose their authority on us just because they disagree with us politically. And that is that fringe group that is noisy, that engages in these kinds of acts, but they are the one who are actually, out in front, emboldened by this populist leader who has appointed himself as being the spokesperson for the voiceless, and whatever measures they take to defy government and to get into the headlines as a people who are actually opposing certain measures, that is where they get their satisfaction from. It's not a collective responsibility to actually deal with this virus. It's just to make a point.
You mentioned President Trump, though not by name. Perhaps it's not surprising that you head into the political direction to talk about this, of course, because you are a politics reporter for Jewish Insider. One of the things I think that so many of us admire about you is that you're not focused on you're not generally focused on the niche issue and concerns of the Haredi community, but you're a national politics reporter for Jewish Insider. But since you do mention President Trump, let me take this opportunity first to note that AJC is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization that neither endorses nor opposes candidates for elective office. And then to ask you a question, because one of the things that I noticed in the videos of the attack on you is that you can see a number of Trump flags. I know that locally, the Haredi community in New York tends to be aligned with Democratic candidates. But the AJC poll that we released this week found that while 3/4 of the American Jewish community at large prefers Vice President Biden, 3/4 of the Orthodox community prefers President Trump. With those flags and that poll in mind, and maybe with the coronavirus skepticism in some sectors of the community in mind as well, is there some kind of a political shift going on in the community? And if so, what would be driving it?
I wouldn't call it a political shift. It's just politics has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. Generally, if you look back at 2012, 2008, and even going back to George W. Bush's re-election in 2004, you'll see the numbers coming out from the election districts within the Orthodox community. There was overwhelming support for Republicans, probably around 65 and 70%. And in 2016, President Trump actually probably matched John McCain's support, but didn't get as close as Mitt Romney got in 2012, just because when there's a charged election, people take sides, but also because Hillary was a known figure within the community. But my point is that, a generic Republican candidate would always get the support of a majority of the Orthodox community just because they align themselves politically, but also, conservative family values, also on abortion, on marriage, even on support for Israel. Obviously, we can't deny that during the 8 years of Obama, there was a campaign, to discredit everything that President Obama did when it came to Israel, just because of the tension that was between the president and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So there is this sort of narrative within the community that the Republican Party is the home for the Orthodox Jewish community. Obviously, as you mentioned in the AJC poll, you saw 18% support for Joe Biden. I would say, that number is a little higher. You'll obviously, if you look at exit polls or at actual results, you'll probably see around 25% support for Joe Biden. But largely, a national Republican running in New York will get around 75% from the Orthodox community. But that is not the case on a local level. Again, in recent years, more people, because they have become engaged in the political process, because since Trump has come onto the scene, people are more engaged you know, social media has become a medium where you can become more engaged. WhatsApp groups, Twitter, and other social media platforms. And therefore, while people are more engaged, they will obviously be more vocal and they will obviously express their opinion. So what you're seeing right now is just more people are expressing their opinion. And as I mentioned before, those who are louder, those are heard.
Yes. That is not a uniquely Haredi problem. I think that America is dealing with. So a few moments ago, you were talking about how the fact that city and state officials kind of ignored the Haredi community and looked the other way, maybe from lapses in following certain coronavirus restrictions, led to things kind of spiraling out of control. There have been moments, especially earlier on in the pandemic, a tweet or two by city officials come to mind, where some elected officials have seemed to pick on the Haredi community. Do you think that the community has legitimate grievances against those making decisions about COVID restrictions?
Absolutely. I mean, Mayor de Blasio just this morning expressed regrets of the approach he took, but also of the kind of rhetoric that he implied that the Orthodox Jewish community was not complying with the social distancing guidelines and the restrictions that he imposed. That was clearly not the case. Governor Cuomo, in his press briefings, when he discussed the uptick in these red zones, specifically singled out the Orthodox Jewish community. He actually presented two pictures of one of a large gathering in Kiryas Joel, Satmar, and one in Crown Heights, which both of them were not representing the real picture in the hotspots, in the red zones of the Brooklyn and Queens communities.
What wasn't one of them from like 14 years ago or something like that?
Yes, but towards the end of that press briefing, they actually switched it to a more recent picture. So I'll give him, I'll give him that. But clearly, at the start, first of all, you have to look back at August 1st, okay? I looked at the numbers. There were reports of a spike in cases starting August 1st. The first press briefing where de Blasio came out publicly, alarming the community about the situation was in September. Okay, so you had 4 months where you could actually deal with the problem by either mass testing or the right outreach to actually bring down the infection rate so we don't go into the high holy days with new restrictions. But it was also the few months between. You have to understand one thing. If you look back at the beginning of April, the community voluntarily closed down houses of worship. Yes, it was a recommendation by the government. Yes, the governor issued an executive order prohibiting services, but it was largely rabbis and community leaders who came together and said, this is serious, we have to deal with it. It was those few months in the summer where the rate went dramatically down that the city had time reaching out to the community, educating them about how severe this is, even though we are not seeing the numbers that we saw at the beginning of the outbreak, but also in implementing certain measures that the community can live with, even going into the high holidays. There were some practical solutions, such as street closures, outdoor services, plenty of solutions that government was presented with that could have avoided this, what some people describe assault on the community. Some people see it just as harsh measures. But I do believe that by singling out the Orthodox Jewish community, and again, it's in certain neighborhoods where there's actually a diverse community. I live in Borough Park for the past 18 years. It's not only Hasidic Jews that live in Borough Park. You have Italian, you have Russians, Asians, Muslims, a Hispanic community. It's a diverse community. So when you look specifically at Borough Park, you cannot just single out one certain community when you know that we are in the midst of a holiday where attending services is probably the only thing that you do the entire day, except of checking your account balance and eating. But it was these few weeks that the government could have stepped up outreach, could have stepped up taking certain measures to encourage mass testing, to encourage the community to actually wear masks and keep social distance. Again, talking about the majority of law-abiding citizens who would follow any guidelines. And this is the time that was lost. And it's not me just saying it, it's people who are in government who are saying that this was not the right approach. It was the mayor himself acknowledging that the approach he took wasn't the right way. And therefore, I think that people are allowed to have grievances. People are allowed to criticize. But what we have to understand is that this is a crisis that we haven't seen before. This is a health crisis. This is about saving lives. So whatever grievances you have, however you see government acting, this shouldn't, guide you in engaging in activity that is against saving lives, that would actually not bring down the infection rate, but actually spread the virus.
So let me just throw kind of like a few quick, like almost lightning round questions at you. And I recognize you don't have necessarily stats at your fingertips for this, but what percentage of the Haredi community in New York would you say recognizes that this is a health crisis on the kind of scale that we should recognize it as?
I would say an overwhelming majority.
So 75, 80%, more than that even.
Whatever you describe, overwhelming majority.
And what about, adhering to masking and to, basic kind of lockdown steps? What percentage?
There was an increase in recent weeks, just because people understand that you cannot ignore what is happening, but also because most of members in the community are not out there to defy government. But again, there's distrust in general in government and in media. But also there was a lack of people actually practicing this, just because we were not aware that this is still happening. And once alerted about it, it was kind of late. The government gave like 7 days for us to adapt. It takes a little longer.
Does the city need to do more outreach in Yiddish, less of a reliance on internet and television outreach? I mean, which just to kind of fill in the gaps, wouldn't reach the Haredi community. What is it that there needs to be more of in order to kind of help the message get through to the community?
Right, you hit the nail on the point. It's basically the right outreach. Obviously, you have to talk their language, but you also have to use the resources of the right allocation, which is if you are going to deploy trucks with loudspeakers in Yiddish, don't send it to Forest Hills in Queens or Staten Island. Send it to Borough Park and certain neighborhoods in Williamsburg. Okay.
Because the religious communities in Forest Hills are generally not of European extraction, and so they don't speak Yiddish. That's what you're saying, right?
Right. When you're going to distribute masks just because, people wouldn't go necessarily and purchase masks, don't send 10,000 masks to a community that is about 150,000 people on the day before Yom Kippur, where people go to shul, attend services the entire day, where you would need probably 2 masks, okay? 10,000 masks is not enough, is not sufficient. Number 3, it is using the voices within the community, those influencers, those leaders who actually could bring awareness to the issue, but also who can influence the community to abide by those guidelines. It is not the governor or the mayor convening a press conference, talking on TV and issuing a press release that is going to bring down the infection rate. It's going to take individuals within the community, but it's also going to take government, because government has the resources, because government actually has what it takes to deal with any crisis, to enforce the restrictions, to actually bring the resources to the right locations so people are aware about the crisis, but also encourage them to do it voluntarily, because at the end, we all want to save lives. This is our guiding principle.
Jacob, I have 2 final questions for you, and then I'll turn it over to Jillian to ask some of the audience questions. And just a reminder to our audience that they can send questions to questions@ajc.org. Questions is plural. The first question, this could be a caricature, but it's my understanding that the most important authorities who people are listening to in the Haredi community, even around the coronavirus, are not doctors, and they're not scientists, and they're not government officials, they're rabbis. What kind of messaging has been coming out from rabbinic authorities in the Haredi community around COVID? Has it been sufficient? I mean, you just suggested a moment ago that the city and the state need to do more to kind of bring those religious influencers over onto their side to help make the case to the community. But left to their own devices, have they been putting forward sufficient effort in order to try to stem the tide in the community?
I think once the community is going to realize that government is not out there to get them, is not out there to impose authority on their religious practices, that community leaders, rabbis, clergy, whoever is out there would all come together to have, a collective effort to actually bring awareness to the issue, but also to deal with it. And I think if you look at recent efforts within the community, you clearly see that being done on the ground, where people are encouraged to do mass testing, where people are wearing masks, avoiding large gatherings, and sort of implementing certain restrictions when it comes to social distancing rules. I do believe that if there is an effort on behalf of government, actually what we have seen in the past few days, where the governor, both the governor and the mayor, have actually reached out to the community, expressed publicly regrets on some rhetoric that they engaged in and the approach that they took. Together, I think people will, again, this is a community who largely abides by the law. And we have worked with government all these years to bring funds to the community, but also to bridge the gaps. And I think when it comes to this crisis, this health crisis, you have to look at it, you have to have your eyes on the ball. You have to look at it as a matter of life and death. And therefore, nobody should relax themselves from any effort that will have the objective of defeating this virus.
Mm-hmm. Jacob, my last question before I turn things over to Jillian and our audience is about the media. There too, people have pointed to coverage that seems to suggest that a good deal of the spreading of coronavirus in New York is because of religious Jews. On the other hand, you are a member of the media, and it was frankly, it was heartwarming to see on Twitter so many public, journalist figures reaching out to you publicly to say that they hope you were all right in the aftermath of the assault and all that. Do you identify more with the journalists who are maybe just trying to do their jobs and occasionally their coverage goes in a direction that that we feel kind of maybe crosses the line toward anti-Semitism? Or do you identify more with the religious Jews who are just trying to live their lives and as a result, have maybe kind of transgressed the coronavirus restrictions from time to time? How do you, square that circle living in two worlds?
Well, you got to first be a human being. And second, do your job ethically, morally, and professionally. And I think that you can separate your opinion from your beliefs from the work that you do, but you don't have to compromise. You can still have those beliefs and that opinion without conflicting it with your work. And therefore, if you're on city government, if you're a member of the media, or if you are just a member of the community, a middle class, small business owner, while you are right to be frustrated at what is happening, and you can take sides in any on any issue and pick any side of the political spectrum, there's also an objective that is our guiding principle, which is to save lives. And so the media and people should, engage in good faith to actually deal with the problem and not create more conflict.
Thank you, Jacob. Jillian, do we have some audience questions?
Thank you, Seffi. We have several audience questions coming in. And the first one comes from Dale Gluck in Chicago, who asks, earlier this year, we were horrified to see hate crimes committed against Orthodox Jews in religious neighborhoods in New York. Have those attacks since diminished?
We've seen an uptick in recent days. Obviously, it's alarming, but clearly since December, city and on a federal level, the administration and state government have taken measures to actually deal with this rise. It's unfortunate that people cannot walk on the street without being attacked just because they're visibly Jewish. But I haven't seen any recent numbers. I've just seen a few reports. And also it has to do with those who actually report the crimes, okay? If you're gonna be egged on the street, if you're gonna be yelled at, anti-Semitic slangs hurled at you or attacked on the street, you better report it. And if you report it, you'll see, number one, authorities could be alerted about it, but also that is when you can assess what the situation is and what measures should be taken. But I haven't seen a recent rise. Obviously, the rise is, it's up and down. It's still a serious problem.
Thank you. The next question comes from Daniel Cohen in Washington, D.C. He asks, can you speak for a moment about rising anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories in the era of COVID-19? Have you yourself been affected by this phenomenon?
I mean, it's an election year as well. So obviously people have opinion, and whatever side you are on, you're either going to believe everything the scientist says, or you're going to doubt everything the experts say just because you disagree with them politically. So again, people are frustrated. This is going on for too long, for way too long. And as long as we are in this pandemic, you'll continue to see loud voices being elevated.
Thank you. The next question comes from Richard Ellen in Atlanta, who asks, what has been the attitude of those more compliant members of the Haredi community towards the more radical members of the community who have been eager to incite violence?
I mean, it's a tough question, just because I've been subject to hate and to attacks because I reported about certain incidents within the community, but also because I'm seen as a member of the media, and also as taking a side in favor of complying with the measures that was imposed by government to deal with this pandemic. It's hard when you live in such a charged society, and when those who are loud could also be violent, when there's a lot of intimidation going around, to actually speak out. But again, it's the silent majority that is actually engaging in good faith to actually comply with the guidelines and to actually be collectively responsible.
Thank you, Jacob. The next question comes from Dusty Brennanman in Queens, New York, who says, yesterday, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio met in person with Jewish community leaders to discuss measures taken to stop the spread of COVID-19 in areas of Brooklyn and Queens with large Jewish populations, and to press for a positive reset in relations. Can you speak a bit more about that meeting and the outcome?
I just reported it a few hours ago. It was reported early on in the morning. The mayor met with a group of community leaders in Gracie Mansion, reached out to them to try and bridge the gaps, to try to lower the tension that exists. I think in recent days, we have seen an effort on both sides to actually deal with the problem, but also try and come up with practical solutions. The fact that the leader of that anti-lockdown movement was exposed as a political stunt, as engaging in activity just to elevate himself to political office, that woke up the people who are responsible to actually step in and represent what is the real voice of the community, a community who is concerned about certain restrictions on religious practices, but also we want to get back to normal and defeat this virus.
Thank you. And on the same note, Jane Bloom in Westchester is asking, can you speak about Andrew Cuomo's recent call with Orthodox Jewish leaders from Brooklyn and Rockland County to discuss these recent tensions we've been discussing?
I just mentioned it in the current answer. There seems to be an effort on state and government officials on their behalf, but also on behalf of the community, to actually come together, lower the rhetoric and the tension, and deal with this crisis.
Jacob, can I jump? Sorry, Jillian, can I jump back in? I wanted to ask Jacob, because I think you're actually very well positioned to speak to this as well. We focused almost entirely, on the Orthodox community, the Haredi community here in New York. How does the story here differ from the story of the way that the Haredi community in Israel is responding to the virus?
First of all, the numbers are dramatically different in Israel. What we have seen in recent weeks is numbers that New Yorkers have experienced beginning of April and going into May. Again, because there's this long period of 6 months where people are getting tired of staying home, of complying with all the guidelines, but also because there's so much tension going on politically in Israel, but also on a society level. You have these protests outside the Prime Minister's residence in the past few months, where you have protesters with masks and keeping some sort of social distancing. But if you're allowing them to congregate in a certain space by the thousands, those in the Haredi community say, well, why can we not gather in our synagogues? Why can't we hold gatherings? But it also has to do on a religious level, where rabbis in the community believe that the damage done to the education system, to the future of the children within the Haredi community, that it's worth the price that we are paying just because there's so much distrust in secular authorities. But I think that that is what separates the Orthodox Jewish community from the Haredi community in Israel. I think here there's an understanding that you cannot just go against government, but also society-wise, we are very different.
Thank you. The next question comes from Samantha Fox in Miami, who's asking, do you think the deepening political divide between Orthodox and secular non-Orthodox Jews exposed by AJC's recent survey is inevitable, or do you see more potential for common ground?
I mean, it's an ongoing shift. I don't see it changing regardless of who gets elected into office. There will always be that, Orthodox community is more conservative, while generally the majority of the American Jewish community is either liberal, progressive, or reform. But also, I think there are issues where you can actually come together. And I think the coronavirus is that one particular issue that we should all be united. Again, on a society level, not only in the American Jewish community, but I think this creates an opening. This could actually be the crack in the glass ceiling, where members of the Orthodox community and members of the mainstream American Jewish community can work together to broaden that conversation, to actually, take certain measures where you can focus on certain issues that unites us rather than what divides us. And again, I think on this particular issue, this is the opportunity to work together.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Danny Goodman in Dallas, who's asking, what are the biggest misconceptions you've heard from Jews of other denominations in the US about the Haredi and Orthodox community's current situation? And how can we, as American Jews, better understand the Haredi community in this moment specifically?
Oh, the greatest misconception is just the fact that the Orthodox community is not complying with the guidelines. I mean, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, overwhelming majority is actually in compliance with all the guidelines. What people can do is reach out to those who are actually within the community, who actually understand the community. In today's virtual world, you can find on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on WhatsApp, on Twitter, plenty of people within the Orthodox community that you could just engage in a conversation, explain where you're coming from and ask them how they view it from their point of view. And I think the more you engage with people within the community and don't look at it from a broader lens, just don't look at it from what you see on your TV screen or what you read in the paper, I think the more you will come to understand the complex issue, but also come to learn about what every community is about.
Jillian, I hope I can cut in for one more question. Jacob, you and I touched on this already earlier, but there are so many questions in our Q&A function here on Zoom from people asking, how is it possible that the Haredi community would be uninformed around, what the various restrictions are, why they're still important, that the pandemic is still going on, and I wonder if you could just touch a little bit more and maybe give people some perspective to help them understand the degree to which the Haredi community is traditionally disengaged from typical media sources, from television, from the internet, from ways that kind of keep the pandemic in the headlines. Can you kind of draw back the curtain for our audience on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, within the community, obviously, a regular family within the community probably doesn't even have a Wi-Fi access. Most of members of the community do not have smartphones, and even those who do have, they do not watch TV. They do not listen to radio. They get the information from two mediums. One is social media, which I would include just because it's not just a singular platform, but mostly from WhatsApp groups, from your family WhatsApp groups, where you meet your friends now virtually, but also in shul.
And just so I think that in the more secular or liberal American Jewish community, and specifically in America, I think WhatsApp is very popular outside the US and very popular in religious communities. But just for people who don't know, basically, when you say social media and you talk about WhatsApp, you're talking about effectively like group text messages, right?
Yeah, but also it is in these groups that you engage in conversation, but it's where you get all these clips and tweets and so on. So they would not take necessarily a New York Times op-ed and break it up into pieces. They would take a singular tweet, and that is why it's a larger conversation about why how President Trump has tapped into that conversation. But it's mainly that is where you get your information from, and in weekend print publications. So you're not always aware of a situation minute by minute, and you not always get the right information. And so you cannot just, imply that a certain community is watching what you are watching, is hearing and getting the information that you're getting, and just simply ignoring it. That is clearly not the case. They sometimes do not get the same information that you would get from reading mainstream print publications or from watching TV or engaging in a conversation broadly. They would only get it in their channels. And therefore it's important, again, that is why people should engage, but that is also why it's important that when people engage in a conversation, that you actually have the facts and you do not spread any rumors or engage in character assassination, because it's very easy to put out a tweet about someone. It's very easy to put out a simple line or two about something that is happening or a rumor, and it spreads like wildfire.
Yeah, I think for so many of us who might, flip on the cable news channel of preference and see, like a running tally of coronavirus cases and deaths and things like that anytime over the past 8 months, or open up our, daily mass distribution newspaper of preference and see major real estate on the page devoted to the coronavirus, or for those of us, God help you, who spend a lot of time on Twitter, and constantly see people tweeting about this, mostly as a question of, how does this affect the political wins for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump? It's really hard to put ourselves in the mindset of people who are not constantly, up to date on the latest news about a vaccine trial, or about what Dr. Fauci said, or this, that, or the other. So thank you for helping people understand that. Let me turn it back to Jillian.
Thank you, Seffi. We have time for about 2 more audience questions. The next one comes from Dane Gold in Seattle, who says, since you spoke about elections earlier and this being an election year, to what extent is the Haredi vote tied to or influenced by particular rabbis?
You do not see what you see in Israel. In 2016, actually, the 2 Satmar sects announced who they are endorsing. I think both endorsed Hillary Clinton, just because of gratitude, just because Hillary Clinton was senator in New York and had a long-standing relationship with them. On a local level, yes, there are voting blocks where community leaders come together to vet the candidates and describe the issues that are at stake. But on a national level, it's just basically a majority is aligned with the Republican Party. And therefore, yes, there will be individuals who will say this is acceptable or unacceptable for me. I will vote differently than my friends and family. But it's not like the rabbis are, directing people whom to vote for. You saw an exception a few weeks ago, where one of the rabbis in Lakewood, in Philadelphia, endorsed President Trump. But again, obviously you'll ask somebody for guidance, you'll ask somebody whom to vote for, probably they will have an opinion, but it's not like driven by rabbinical authority.
Thank you for that context, Jacob. And our last question comes from Claudia Rowe in San Francisco, who asks, have you received any outreach or attention from non-Jews or non-Jewish outlets about your coverage of COVID-19 in the Orthodox communities? And if so, what has that experience been like?
Obviously, I'm the hot cake in recent days. If you Google my name, you'll just see how many times I mentioned, it's not that I want to be the center of the story, but I think that, yes, because I live in the community, I have an opportunity to actually explain how complex this issue is, but also give you an inside look of how members of the community look at this. And again, you can follow me on Twitter at Jacob Kornbluh, where I'm pretty active, and you can DM me and reply to my tweets, but also follow my, as you mentioned at the beginning, I am part of a team that creates that fantastic morning newsletter, where you'll get an insight to everything that is happening within the Jewish community. But also, it is events like this where, Seffi, I appreciate for you doing this, giving me the opportunity to actually explain what is happening. But yes, definitely there are important voices out there on both sides of the aisle in all communities that could give you more insight. Just do not believe everything that you see, everything that you read, but just look at it from a practical level, but also try and read and watch those who actually know what's happening, who actually know the situation.
Jacob, thank you so much for these critical insights and spending the hour with us. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Let me now turn to Jillian to take us out.
Thank you, Seffi, and thank you, Jacob, again for joining us for this timely conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC by visiting ajc.org/donate. And again, if you enjoyed Advocacy Anywhere, please subscribe to our podcast by visiting ajc.org/podcast or your favorite podcast app to subscribe today. Thank you all and goodbye.